My name is Molly Yarn. I'm an independent scholar, and I'm the author of Shakespeare's Lady Editors, A New History of the Shakespearean Text. The book is about the history of women who edited Shakespeare between 1800 and 1950. The reason it's important to understand the history of editing is that the Shakespeare editor actually exerts a great deal of power over the text that we as modern readers receive. They make a lot of choices that essentially determine what you see on the page, because the early Shakespearean texts, for various reasons, are pretty unstable. For example, Hamlet was printed in 3 early editions, so we have Q1, Q2, and folio. An editor has to look at the 3 texts, decide what their text is going to look like. If you think of a Shakespeare editor at all, you probably think of, for example, Samuel Johnson or a similar old white literary man sitting in an office or a very fancy library that most people couldn't get into. But in the 70s and 80s, a number of really brilliant women scholars drew attention to this gender gap and worked really hard to diversify the field, to break into the modern world of Shakespeare editing. So the exciting thing about my book is that through looking at unpublished archival material and undervalued books, I've been able to find that there's a women's editorial tradition that goes back a lot farther and is a lot richer and more complex than we had previously understood. When I started this research, I knew of about sort of 20 to 25 women editors who had worked prior to the modern period, and a few of them had had some really wonderful studies done about them individually. But there hadn't yet been any work done that was really an overview of all of them and what they had in common. So I thought that would be an interesting topic, and as I said, I went into it knowing of about sort of 20 to 25, and I hope to find a few more, but in fact, I found almost 70. So what you'll find in the book are stories about these women's lives, and that's what I love about it. It's about more than Shakespeare editing or the history of criticism. It's about women's history, the struggle for women's rights. It's about friendships and rivalries and sex and love and sometimes marriage, and it's about families and childhood. It's about war and revolution. It's about women's lives, and it's exciting. It's always exciting to be able to look into the past and find these people who've been overlooked and to find a way to pay tribute to what they've done. Over the years, part of the reason that these women and their work has been forgotten is because the books that they produced weren't considered valuable. They were made for children, or they were made for other women, or they were made for working class people. They weren't that sort of high-minded, beautifully bound, monumental edition of Shakespeare that you would see in libraries. They were little books. Because the field hasn't valued them as much, it's been easy for us to forget what these women were doing. On a personal level, as a Shakespeare scholar, I love that because of this, I'm now able to look back at the last few centuries of Shakespeare criticism and Shakespeare reception in a totally different way, and to know that it wasn't just homogenous, exclusionary field. It was that, but it was also something much more complicated, something that brought different types of people into it and gave them a voice in the transmission of Shakespeare, and an important voice. So many of Shakespeare's women editors lived extraordinary lives, but at the base of it, most of them were educators. It was their calling, it was their passion, and it was their day job. They were editing for the place where people first meet Shakespeare and the place where they first experience him. And ultimately, it was these little books that made Shakespeare available to the people who didn't have access to those leather-bound copies in private libraries. They were the books that people read as children, and they were the books in which they encountered Shakespeare for the first time. I realized when I was working on this that when I thought about it, I could still picture the cover of the book, of the edition of King Lear that I first read in high school. And I could picture it so well that I was actually able to go online and to search it, and I found it. And it turns out it was actually edited by a woman, that edition. Ultimately, I think the book is about how we decide which books are valuable. I've had the great honor and privilege to be taught by and to learn from the women who were at the forefront of Shakespeare editing in the 70s and 80s, who really changed the field. And I've been able to build on their work, and I hope that people will be able to build on mine and continue to find ways to celebrate women's lost literary labor.